In order to understand some of the subtleties of bonds, we need to talk about some particular issues that bonds have. There will be provisions that are laid out in the bond indenture, in the fine print that's on the face of that bond. One of them is going to be a provision for convertibility. Not all bonds have a convertibility provision. However, if it does, what this means is that the bondholder has the right to exchange this bond for a certain number of shares of stock after a certain time if the bondholder wants to. This gives the bondholder an alternative to holding the debt of a company. If they believe that the stock is worth more than the bond, they can trade in their bond in exchange for a certain number of shares of stock. They won't have to pay anything extra for that. Kind of the opposite of this would be something called callability. Callability gives the bond issuer, the company that's borrowing the money, the right to repurchase their bonds before they mature. So there will be a date at which the bond could be called. It's not going to be callable immediately. But the company could call back their bonds, and they would have to pay the purchasers, the bondholders, the $1,000 face value plus some sort of a premium that's been agreed upon in advance. This gives companies some flexibility. It gives them the opportunity to refinance their debt at a more favorable interest rate. To give you an analogous situation, think about a homeowner with a mortgage interest rate of, say, 12%. If they got their mortgage back in the days when mortgage rates were very, very high, given today's environment, they would want to refinance and get a rate closer to 4%. By refinancing their debt, they're able to improve their financial situation, and it makes sense to do that. Companies face this issue all the time, so callability is a fairly common clause in a bond. And remember, because this is going to give flexibility to the company, it's going to be something which is going to reduce the value of the bond in the eyes of the bondholder, in the eyes of the purchaser. It's going to push down the price. And so the company offers a premium if they call back that bond. This is going to help balance that price upwards a little bit more. It's going to support a higher price for the bond so that they don't lose value for callability. Another provision that you might want to be aware of are something called warrants. A warrant is a contract which is connected to the bond, which gives the bondholder the right to purchase a certain number of shares of stock at a specific price and a specific time. Now, this is different from convertibility because this allows the bondholders to make a purchase. It's not an exchange of the bond for shares. It is that the bondholder will lay out cash at a specified price in order to buy those shares in addition to the bond. Moreover, warrants can be separated from a bond. So this gives the bondholder something which they can take and sell separately from the bond. They can continue to hold the debt in the company, but they can sell that warrant in order to get a little bit of extra cash. This means that this becomes a sort of a sweetener for somebody who's going to buy that bond. This becomes an incentive for investors to buy these bonds, and it's going to, again, support a somewhat higher price on the bond and therefore a lower yield or a lower rate of interest that the issuing company is going to have to pay. In all of these cases, what we're trying to find out are what rights and responsibilities do each of these parties have. The bond indenture is going to cover other rights and responsibilities, including when the payments are made, what the amount of the payments are. But these three items are really kind of special items that are going to affect the value of the bond in the eyes of the shareholder, or rather in the eyes of the bondholder. And if we're going to explore that, we also need to think about the idea of yield and identify some terminology around yield. When I've said yield so far, I've really meant yield to maturity. What is the amount of return that we're going to get based on the length of time until the bond matures, until that face value gets paid out at the end of the timeline. Another abbreviation that we might use for yield to maturity is YTM. So if we're solving for YTM, if we're solving for yield to maturity, we're going to solve for I using the number of periods until the bond matures, and we'll annualize the number if it's appropriate. In contrast to that, we might also want to know what the yield to call is. So the callability provision, if it is activated, is going to change the value of the bond, and an investor might want to know what this is. The yield to call, or YTC, we're going to solve for I using the number of periods until the bond can be called. To illustrate this, think of a bond which matures in 12 years, but is callable in 8. If it's a semi-annual bond, the yield to maturity would use 24 periods. The yield to call would use 16 periods. In contrast to both of these is probably the easiest computation you'll make during the course of this class, and that's the current yield. The current yield is simply this. It's the annual payment in dollars divided by the market price right now. So if we have a 10% bond with a $1,000 face value, the annual payment would be $100. It would be two $50 payments. If it was semi-annual, but we'd still call that a $100 annual payment. And if that bond was selling for $1,100, we're going to find that the current yield is actually going to be a little over 9%. 9.09% is what I get on my calculator.